Disturbing hook. First 8 seconds should pull the viewer into dread and curiosity. She was admitted on a Tuesday. By Friday, her heartbeat stopped. No cause listed, no family notified, and she wasn't the only one. 145 bodies, not one recovery. Now tell me, what kind of hospital has a 0% success rate? Beneath the roaring cobblestone arteries of 1844 New York, where horse-drawn hearses passed silently at dawn, there stood a building that called itself a hospital. Its limestone walls soaked in suffering, its corridors silent as crypts. Officially, it was St. Eliza's Institute for the Chronically Ill. Unofficially, locals called it the last room you'd ever see. It wasn't built for healing, it was built for control. The kind of control that doesn't come from chains or guns, but from rituals, silence, and belief. This was not medicine. This was something older, something that wore the mask of science but fed on something much deeper. The records, what's left of them, speak in riddles. 145 patients admitted over 7 years, every single one declared dead, not a single recovery, no discharges, no survivors, no autopsies, and for some, no bodies returned at all. When city inspectors finally breached its sealed halls in 1851, they found no medical equipment, no patient files, no traces of standard treatment. But they did find rooms lined with mirrors facing inward, symbols carved behind the plaster, chains embedded in the floor of the lower levels, and on the third sub-basement wall, a phrase scratched in blood-dry ink: "They fed us prayers instead of bread." But St. Eliza's isn't just a story of death, it's a story of transformation, of a system that learned how to disguise imprisonment as care and sacrifice as medicine. The institution didn't die, it simply changed its name and its methods. You're not watching this by accident, you're here because you felt it. Something wrong in the way we're told to trust systems, hospitals, churches, governments. But what if healing was never their purpose? What if the sickness was always the point? Now listen carefully. What you're about to hear is not a tale of the past. It's the blueprint for what still operates today. They said it began with compassion, that the Sisters of Sacred Wounds, 6 veiled women from Bavaria, traveled across the Atlantic in 1842 with a holy mission, to build a sanctuary for the incurable, the dying, and the forgotten. But compassion was never what made this place survive. What truly kept it alive was secrecy. The land they were given, 6 acres donated by a New York industrialist named Lucien Voss, had already earned its own reputation. Locals refused to hunt there. Children who wandered too close came home mute for days. Animals wouldn't cross the southern fence. And Voss himself, dead within a year of signing the deed, found in a clawfoot tub of water turned black, eyes open but pupils gone. Still the church claimed the land and the building rose quickly. Too quickly. Stone by stone, funded by European donors no one could name, the hospital was completed in under 7 months. But what drew attention wasn't the speed, it was the architecture. There were no open wards, no windows on the upper floors, no bell for summoning nurses. What it did have were iron doors, one-way stairwells, and basements that descended farther than the city had permits to allow. People assumed the sisters were just reclusive, rigid in their rituals. That's how darkness survives, behind the mask of devotion. But some things don't stay buried. The first real warning came from a gravedigger named Elias Boone. In 1844, he was contracted to dig a mass burial trench for 12 unnamed patients who had expired of fever. He was told not to open the body bags. He didn't listen. What he found inside those sacks wasn't disease, it was trauma. Burn marks in geometric shapes, removed tongues, scratched out eyelids, scars that looked like brands rather than wounds. Boone went silent. Quit the job, moved to Pennsylvania, but before he left he told his neighbor, they weren't patients, they were offerings. And that's when the first whispers began, about what St. Eliza's was really treating and what it was feeding. They told the public it was a hospital. But hospitals don't have confessionals in every room. Hospitals don't ring bells at 3:33 a.m. Hospitals don't hire nurses who take vows of silence. By 1845, St. Eliza's had already claimed its first 28 patients. None of them walked out. Not one had a family notified of their death. All were said to have passed peacefully in the presence of the divine. But there were no burial records, no certificates, just a line in the hospital ledger, released from flesh. The sisters said it was symbolic, but one former custodian, who lasted less than 2 weeks inside the facility, described something far more physical. He said the air inside was always cold, unnaturally so, that prayers were chanted not in Latin, but in a tongue that didn't sound European at all, and that when he accidentally entered the wrong room one night, he saw a patient strapped to a bed, eyes sewn open, mouth covered in wax, while 4 nuns stood in perfect stillness around him. He ran, quit, but didn't tell his story until years later, on his deathbed. That same year, strange reports began circulating through New York's underground press. A man named Francis Mallory published a pamphlet titled The Flesh Engine, St. Eliza's and the Industry of Souls. It was filled with bizarre allegations, claims that the hospital wasn't healing illness but harvesting suffering, that patients were subjected to structured torment, emotional manipulation, and sensory deprivation not for cure, but for collection. Collection of what? Mallory didn't say, but he drew diagrams of ritual circles, medical restraints shaped like crucifixes, and machines with glass tubes designed to trap human breath. He was dismissed as a lunatic. Of course he was. But 6 months later, Mallory was found dead in the East River. No wounds, no water in the lungs. He hadn't drowned. He'd simply stopped. No one came forward to claim the body. But in his coat pocket, police found a single slip of paper. On it were 4 words, scrawled in a shaking hand. They eat our pain. If they eat our pain, then what exactly were they feeding? In the spring of 1846, a woman named Eleanor Sloane was admitted to St. Eliza's, a widow, 32 years old, no known illness, no fever, no visible injury. But she claimed something was following her. Not a man, not a spirit. She described it as a hunger with eyes, said it whispered through walls and left coins in her shoes, that whenever she bled, even slightly, she'd hear a voice say, "Thank you." Her admission record was brief. Symptoms: delusion, night disturbance, blood hallucinations. She was placed in Ward 6, but Ward 6 didn't officially exist. None of the public floor plans showed it. It was only discovered decades later, sealed behind a false wall in the West Wing basement. A hidden corridor, no windows, 7 rooms, each with a metal floor, each stained deep into the grain, as if blood had been scrubbed 1,000 times but never left. In one room, they found something stranger, a mural. It stretched across the back wall, painted in dried ink, rust, or maybe worse. It showed a tree, but not one from this world. Its trunk was made of screaming faces, its roots were fingers, and its fruit were heads. Above the tree were the Latin words, "Sustenere dolorem," sustain the pain. Researchers who later examined it noted something impossible. The mural had no brushstrokes. It had not been painted. The substance had somehow bled through the stone itself, as if the wall had been soaked in memory. Eleanor Sloane was never discharged. No death record, no burial, no family notification, just another entry in the hospital's private log. Patient 145, fully harvested, vessel depleted, tree remains fed. Now ask yourself, what kind of place doesn't just treat the sick, but uses them? What kind of hospital has a harvest log, and more importantly, what exactly is growing underground? Let me ask you something most men never dare consider. What if healing was never the goal? What if the sickness was the offering? Hospitals as we know them are built on trust. You lie down, vulnerable. You hand over your body, your pain, your secrets. You allow them to sedate you, cut into you, bleed you, and you believe, because you must, that it's all for your good. But St. Eliza's was different. It required suffering, not as a byproduct of treatment, but as a source of power. In 1844, 2 years after the hospital's opening, an anonymous letter was sent to the mayor of New York. It was unsigned, sealed in black wax. Inside, only 3 words were written in blood-red ink: "They feed below." The letter was dismissed as lunacy, filed away, forgotten. Until decades later, a city official discovered something buried beneath the hospital's west foundation, an architectural anomaly. a staircase that descended 33 steps deeper than the official blueprints allowed. At the bottom was a stone door carved with a symbol no one could identify. A circle of 12 keys surrounding an open mouth. No lock, no handle, just stone, solid and silent. Behind it, a sound like breathing. The door was never opened. Days after the discovery, the city condemned the hospital. They cited structural instability, but survivors say otherwise. A nurse, Elena Mendez, who worked night shifts in 1845, gave a testimony in her final days. She was 94, bedridden, half-blind, but her voice never shook when she spoke of what she saw. She said on certain nights, a bell would ring from the basement, not the hospital bell, a deeper tone, one no one admitted installing. When it rang, patients on the third floor would seize, some would convulse, others would speak in voices not their own. And those who didn't survive the night? She claimed their blood was collected, not in medical containers, but in Alice's, stored, catalogued, offered. You're not supposed to know this. You were meant to sleep through it, to believe it was just history, just superstition. But now that you've seen the edge of the curtain, will you keep going, or are you afraid of what's behind it? By spring of 1845, the public face of St. Eliza's was polished perfection. Clergymen blessed the grounds, physicians praised its cleanliness, the newspapers, paid or persuaded, called it a modern miracle. But in the private corridors, in the rooms without names, the real work had begun. There were no funerals, no obituaries, just silence, followed by a new name on the roster. The hospital accepted only the desperate, the broken, the socially discarded, and each one had to sign away all visitation rights. Once admitted, patients vanished into the system. But some families didn't accept the silence. One man, Jacob Whitfield, a blacksmith from Red Hook, tried to retrieve his brother Samuel after weeks without word. He broke into the hospital one storm-drenched night, armed with nothing but a lantern and a revolver. He never made it past the second floor. The hospital claimed he had a nervous episode and fell down the east stairwell. His body was never returned to the family. His brother's name was quietly removed from the records. But Jacob left behind something far more damning: a journal. Pages soaked in rain and panic, found near a broken window behind the hospital. Inside were fragmented notes, smeared ink, and this sentence, underlined twice. "The dead here, don't stay cold." He described hearing voices in languages he didn't know, hallways that changed length, walls that breathed, and a scream from the inside of a locked furnace. And then, this: they don't heal you, they open you. What kind of hospital builds entire wings without windows? What kind of treatment requires patients to be blindfolded and gagged for spiritual purification? What kind of medicine is performed only at night? The deeper you go into this story, the more it begins to resemble something older than science. This wasn't healthcare, it was harvest, a harvest of suffering, of memory, of something the church and the state refused to name. But you're beginning to see it, aren't you? This wasn't mismanagement, it wasn't superstition, it was ritual, and it didn't end in 1847. They say a man knows when his wife is dead, but Klaus Hoffmann didn't feel death. He felt something worse. An emptiness that reached out from the woods behind the hospital like fingers clawing at his soul. 6 weeks. 6 weeks without a word. 6 weeks of praying, pleading, begging Father Kessler for updates that never came. And then, the knock on the door. It was Wilhelm Brenner, a fellow miner, shaking, pale, changed. He wasn't a man given to superstition, but what he saw that night rewired something in him, and once he spoke, Klaus never saw the world the same again. Wilhelm had been walking home past the hospital, midnight, quiet, the moon hidden. He heard the grind of cartwheels on frozen ground, coming from the rear of the building where there were no roads. 2 figures, hooded, robed in black, dragging a white-wrapped shape. Too small to be an adult, but unmistakably human. They moved without speaking, without struggling, as if they'd done this before. He followed them, not too close, just close enough to see. They disappeared into a narrow trail that led into the woods, a trail no one knew was there. It cut behind the hill, out of sight of the town, a secret path. But the part Wilhelm couldn't forget, the part that made him gag as he told it, was the smell. It wasn't death, he said. It was sweetness, like flowers that rotted too long. It got inside my teeth. That was the moment Klaus knew. Something was happening at St. Catherine's Hospital that had nothing to do with healing. He gathered 4 men, all miners, all fathers. All of them had loved ones vanish behind those limestone walls. They arrived at dawn, demanded answers. But what greeted them was not a doctor, not even a priest. It was Bergman, sitting on what looked like a throne, reading from a book no one recognized, its pages written in a language that moved when you stared too long. And when Klaus demanded to see Sarah, the smile vanished. The priest's voice dropped into a whisper that echoed unnaturally across the stone walls. "Your wife," he said, "is in the delicate stage. Disturb her now, and you don't just kill her, you damn her soul." No one spoke after that, because in that moment the air turned ice cold, and they knew. They were not speaking to a man anymore. They were speaking to something older, something inside him, something that didn't need to lie, and whatever it was, it already had Sarah. Forever. There is a reason certain buildings are never torn down, not because they're protected, not because they're sacred, but because whatever was built underneath them was never meant to be found. By the winter of 1844, rumors were no longer whispers, they were warnings. The townspeople spoke of a weeping bell that rang at midnight from the depths of the hospital's basement, even though no bell tower had ever been constructed. Hoffman's disappearance triggered a wave of silent paranoia among the miners' families. Men refused to allow their wives to seek treatment. Children were kept indoors at dusk, and yet, the hospital continued to accept new patients. None ever returned. Klaus Hoffmann wasn't alone in his suspicions. He began quietly gathering testimonies, men who had seen wagons leave the hospital at night, always covered in white cloth. Women who had walked past the estate and felt something watching them from the trees. A boy who claimed he saw fire under the ground near the hillside behind the hospital. But the real break came from someone unexpected, Father Kessler. The elderly priest who had once defended Father Bergman now came to Klaus with trembling hands and a heart full of regret. He'd been allowed, briefly, into the hospital's library, and what he found there shattered his faith. The books were not of God. They were not even of this world. One was written entirely in human blood, stitched together with sinew. Another described a covenant of sanctified inversion, a doctrine that reversed every sacrament of the church and transformed healing into a sacrificial rite. At the center of it all was a name, not Bergman, something older, forgotten. Kessler warned that the hospital was no longer a place of healing but a gateway, a ritual site cloaked in medical form, a machine designed to extract something from suffering souls. And the patients? They were birthed and being treated. They were being harvested. This was no longer about one woman. It was about all of them. Klaus knew what had to be done, but he also knew what it would cost. He would need to go back inside. Alone, armed not with weapons, but with the only thing the priest had given him that could protect him. A single phrase, written in Latin, burned onto parchment, and wrapped in cloth soaked with holy water. The phrase, "Sanctus moriorum non tacet." The sanctified dead do not remain silent. Klaus was about to find out why. The town of Bradenville changed after that night. Not in the way stories usually go, not with fires or riots or open rebellion. No. Something darker settled in. A hush. A withdrawal. Men stopped talking in the taverns, women stopped asking questions, and children were told never, never to look toward the hill after sundown. Because by then, they all knew. Something lived inside that hospital, and it wasn't healing anyone. What started as whispered rumors became local truth. You could tell who had a loved one in St. Catherine's by the way they walked. Slow, sunken, like their souls had been partially removed. These weren't hopeful families awaiting a cure. They were mourners in waiting, and deep down, every man who walked that 5-mile dirt road with a wife, a child, or a brother knew they would not be walking back together. But the strangest part, the town didn't revolt. They didn't storm the gates or burn the building to the ground. They let it stand, because fear, true fear, doesn't scream. It obeys. Father Bergman had created something worse than a prison. He had built a cathedral of silence, a place where suffering went to vanish and no one dared demand its return. Every now and then, a cart would leave the hospital in the dead of night, always covered, always guarded, always traveling down the hidden path into the woods, and people stopped asking what was inside, because the few who did, they went missing too. The mine began losing workers, not to accidents, but to disappearances. Men would go up to speak to Father Bergman about a loved one and never be seen again, their homes left undisturbed, no signs of struggle, just absence. And the church? The Diocese of New York sent no investigators, no inspections, only more funding, more priests, more silence, and what no one in the town understood, what they were never supposed to understand, was this. St. Catherine's was not failing. It was working exactly as intended. It wasn't a hospital, it was a system, a machine designed to extract something ancient from the human soul, and it was just getting started. Klaus Hoffmann could no longer wait. The second month passed without a single word about Sarah, no letter, no message, no confirmation that she was even still alive, and the moment that finally shattered his obedience wasn't dramatic, it was a quiet, mundane horror. He found Sarah's wedding ring, not in their home, not in her belongings, but sold at the general store, traded for supplies by one of the hospital's staff. When Klaus demanded to know how they had come by it, the young attendant stammered something about personal effects, about standard procedure. But Klaus wasn't listening anymore. He was already gone, marching back up that winding, cursed road toward the hospital. He carried no weapon, only certainty. It was after midnight when he reached the gates. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds and the cold wind howled like an omen. But what shook Klaus most was not the chill, it was the smell. A sickly sweet rot clung to the ground like fog. He didn't knock. He didn't wait. He pushed the great wooden door open and stepped inside, the place where no man had returned from whole. The interior was almost church-like, polished floors, flickering candles, Latin inscriptions on the walls. But the silence was total, oppressive, no nurses, no patients, no echo of life, just rows of doors and something humming deep beneath the floor, like a distant organ drone. He crept down the hall, searching room after room, empty beds, dusty trays, locked drawers, until he reached the staircase to the basement. It wasn't marked. In fact, it wasn't even on the original blueprints he'd seen during construction, but it was there, hidden behind a tapestry of St. Agatha, the patroness of nurses. Klaus descended, step by step, into a darkness that didn't feel natural. The smell intensified, so did the hum, no longer mechanical but vocal, like voices layered in pain, and there at the bottom was a corridor, lined with iron doors, some sealed shut, others left cracked open. He peeked through one, and what he saw in that room would never be spoken of again, not by him, because Klaus Hoffmann was never seen in Bradenville again. But 2 weeks later, his voice was heard screaming beneath the earth, and no one dared answer it. When the screaming started, it came not from the hospital, but from the ground. Miners in the lower shafts of Bradenville, working beneath the hills near St. Catherine's, reported hearing something unnatural in the tunnels. It wasn't the sound of shifting stone or rushing air. It wasn't even rats or cave winds. It was human. One of the miners, Josef Malik, a Czech immigrant who had worked mines across Europe, described it best. It was the scream of someone being unmade. Not just tortured, but stripped of everything they were, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but the scream itself. The sounds became more frequent. Night shifts grew restless, tools were dropped, crosses were clutched, some refused to return underground at all. And always the scream seemed to come from the direction of the hill where the hospital stood, as if something buried beneath it was echoing into the earth. Meanwhile, Father Bergman made his first public appearance in weeks. He stood at the pulpit of the town chapel, his eyes more hollow than ever, his skin a shade closer to stone. He preached not of hope, but of sacrifice, of spiritual transformation through pain. He quoted obscure scripture texts that even the elder clergy didn't recognize. The flesh must be broken to reveal the spirit. The mind must be torn to birth true healing. Pain is the only baptism that cannot be faked. No one dared question him, but every man in that church knew this was no longer medicine, this was ritual. Within days, a second family reported a missing loved one, then a third. and when a group of miners returned to the basement tunnel they'd sealed off months before due to structural weakness, they found something embedded in the rock. A door. A door made not of wood or stone, but metal burned black, covered in symbols none of them could read, symbols that shimmered under lamplight, as if alive. Behind that door, they heard chanting. Not Latin, not German, not human. And they fled, dropping their gear, sprinting into the dark, abandoning their posts forever. What had begun as a hospital was now something else entirely. A temple, a machine, a mouth. And Bradenville was beginning to realize they were being fed to it. Klaus Hoffmann returned to the hilltop one final time, not with prayers, not with hope, but with a loaded rifle and 2 other men who'd both lost wives to St. Catherine's silence. They reached the hospital just after dusk. The building loomed like a mausoleum carved from the mountain itself, the windows dark, the trees around it unnaturally still. Even the wind, which usually screamed through the hollows, had vanished. The men swore the air itself felt thick, like stepping into a cathedral built for something that wasn't God. They didn't knock. They forced the door open. Inside, they found something worse than the unknown. They found order. The halls were pristine, polished, waxed. Candles lined the corridor walls, burning low with violet-blue flames. The scent of something sweet and rotting hung heavy in the air, jasmine twisted with iron. There were no nurses, no patients, no noise, only that sense that they had entered something that watched them back. They moved room by room. Examination tables stood bare, surgical tools gleamed on cloth, religious icons adorned the walls, but not just Christian. There were other symbols, carved into the stone, etched behind mirrors, sewn into curtains, ancient spiral-like glyphs that twisted the stomach to look at for too long. Klaus found Sarah's name on a patient chart hanging in a locked cabinet. Her file was empty. No dates, no outcomes. Just a single note at the bottom in Father Bergman's handwriting. Patient transitioned. 17th of March, Path 3. No one knew what Path 3 meant. They heard a noise then, a deep metallic clang from below. The basement. The 3 men descended the narrow staircase together, hearts pounding like drums of war. The stairs creaked not with weight, but with age, as though they hadn't been walked in centuries. As they reached the stone floor of the underground, the temperature dropped instantly, and in the dark, something was humming. Low, mechanical, ritualistic. There were no hospital beds here, no medicine, only doors, sealed iron doors with no handles. Behind them, a voice began to whisper. Not from any mouth, from inside their minds, and one word repeated again and again. Become. They turned and ran. But deep below, the machine had already begun its next operation. The men who returned from St. Catherine's that night were not the same. Not just shaken, not just afraid, but altered, like a part of them had stayed behind in that underground place, and something else had followed them out. Klaus didn't speak for 2 days. When he finally did, he told Father Kessler everything. The basement, the doors, the symbols, the whispers, and then he handed the old priest Sarah's chart, and the cryptic phrase, Path 3. Kessler's face paled. He didn't know what Path 3 was, but he recognized the style of the note. It wasn't Father Bergman's alone. It was the same cryptic phrasing used by a secret branch of the church he'd heard whispers of in seminary, the Order of St. Novatus, an ancient sect allegedly purged from the Vatican in the 14th century. One that believed illness was not to be healed, but transfigured. They believed suffering opened the soul to forces that predated Christ. That true spiritual evolution required ritual exposure to death, decay, and pain. They claimed saints were made not through miracles, but mutilation. Father Kessler, horrified, began to dig through old archives, personal letters, even smuggled ecclesiastical records, and what he found chilled him. Father Bergman's real name wasn't Bergman. It was Heinrich Brandt. He had been excommunicated from the Bavarian seminary in 1826 for unorthodox practices involving dead bodies and psionic prayer. He'd traveled to Romania, then Egypt, then disappeared for over a decade. When he resurfaced in America under a new identity, he brought money, credentials, and a theology stitched together from medicine, mysticism, and something older, something he only called the deep pattern. Kessler now knew this wasn't a hospital. It was an altar, and the patients were not being treated, they were being prepared. That night he wrote a letter sealed in wax and sent it to the Vatican. He never received a reply. But 1 week later, 2 strangers arrived in town. They wore black suits, spoke no names, asked no questions. But they came with a single purpose: seal the hospital, erase the records, silence the witnesses. Because what had been opened on that hilltop in New York in 1844 was not meant for this world. The 2 men in black didn't speak to anyone directly. They didn't threaten, they didn't warn. They simply moved from house to house, from church to rectory, from the county clerk's office to the sheriff's own porch. And wherever they went, people stopped asking questions. It was like a shadow fell over Bradenville, a silence that wasn't agreed upon, but obeyed. 1 week after their arrival, the local newspaper published a single-line obituary. St. Catherine's Hospital for the Afflicted has ceased operations due to lack of funding. No patients remain in residence. No names, no deaths, no mention of the 52 people who had been admitted and never seen again. Klaus tried to resist the silence. He tried to raise his voice. But every time he did, he was met with subtle consequences. His mining hours were cut. His house was vandalized. The sheriff stopped answering his door, and Father Kessler was gone. Overnight. No explanation. His chapel padlocked. Only one thing remained where his bed had once been: a leather-bound journal. Klaus read it cover to cover in a single night. And what it contained wasn't just records, it was confession. Page after page of theological theories, forbidden rituals, and Bergman's real plan. St. Catherine's wasn't the first. It was the latest in a long lineage of hidden treatment centers across Europe and the Americas, each one operating under the same guiding principle: pain unlocks divinity. The patients weren't random. They were chosen, specifically those near death, those desperate, those pliable. The goal wasn't healing, it was transmutation, a forced initiation into something beyond human, something that required suffering to complete its process. Klaus knew then, his wife hadn't just died, she had been offered, and the moment he understood that, he wasn't afraid anymore. He was furious, and that fury would become the only light in the darkness he was about to walk into, because the deeper he went, the more he realized this hospital was only the beginning. Klaus Hoffmann disappeared from public life that spring, not because he gave up, but because he went underground, literally. Using old mine maps and the Thornwood estate blueprints he stole from the county archives, he began tracking every tunnel, shaft, and subterranean passage connected to the hospital grounds. And what he found wasn't a foundation. It was a labyrinth. Dozens of sealed corridors carved deep into the limestone bedrock. Rooms with no doors, chambers lined with salt and scripture, and one path that led farther than the rest. Beneath the hospital was a tunnel older than any mine, older than the Thornwood estate. Its walls weren't carved by tools, but melted smooth as if fire itself had tunneled its way through the earth. And at the end of it was a door, not made of wood or stone, but of something Klaus couldn't identify. Cold, black, seamless, etched with symbols that twisted the eye when you tried to read them. The door didn't open, but it throbbed, like it was alive. Klaus didn't need to open it to understand what it was. It was a gate, and St. Catherine's Hospital was built not to heal the sick, but to feed the thing behind it. Father Bergman wasn't a man of medicine. He was a guardian, a priest of something older than Christianity. A surgeon of souls, yes, but not to save them, to convert them. Pain was the sacrament, despair was the offering, and death was just the beginning of the transformation. Klaus realized what few men in history ever do. Some institutions don't fail because they're broken. They succeed at exactly what they were built for. And once you understand that, you don't look at hospitals, churches, or governments the same way again. You see the design, you see the layers, and most terrifying of all, you see how deep the tunnels go. That night, Klaus returned to the hidden tunnel with oil, rope, a pickaxe, and 2 lanterns. He wasn't going back for justice, he was going back for Sarah. The path beneath St. Catherine's felt more like a crypt than a hospital. The deeper he went, the more the air changed, thickened, like breathing through wet velvet. The stone walls began to sweat, the silence so total it crushed every footstep under a blanket of dread. Then he heard it. Not a scream, not a moan, but chanting, low, rhythmic, ancient. A language with no syllables, only vibrations. Klaus couldn't understand it, but his bones did. His stomach turned, his fingers shook. That voice wasn't just echoing, it was calling. And then he saw them, figures in robes, dozens, each with a lantern that burned blue, not yellow. They walked in a spiral toward the center of a vast underground chamber, a room that didn't exist on any blueprint. Carved into a dome of natural stone, it was filled with symbols, salt circles, and, at its center, an altar. On the altar lay Sarah, pale, motionless, draped in red cloth. But her eyes were open, staring. Klaus couldn't move, he couldn't breathe. Then the priest entered. Not Father Bergman. Something else. Taller, too tall. His face was hidden under a hood, but his arms were visible, long and wrong. They bent where elbows shouldn't be, and around his wrists were shackles, not restraining him, but hanging open. Klaus felt something whisper behind his left ear, though no one stood there, a voice inside him that wasn't his own. "She is already across. You are only here to see it." He dropped the lantern. The chamber didn't ignite. It screamed. The fire didn't burn. It howled. The figures wailed and scattered. The priest turned, but Klaus was already gone, running up the tunnel, lungs filled with ash and madness. He didn't stop until he reached the tree line. When he turned back, the hospital was silent. But the smoke that rose from its foundation wasn't black. It was blue. The fire didn't destroy St. Catherine's Hospital, not entirely. By morning, the building still stood, scarred, scorched, but not collapsed. Local authorities arrived, summoned by smoke seen miles away, but by the time they stepped inside, the place was empty. No patients, no staff, no bodies, not even ashes. The hospital had been stripped clean, beds were made, equipment neatly stored, food left uneaten. It was as if the hospital had never been occupied at all, and yet the villagers who arrived with the constables could still smell the smoke, and in some rooms, particularly on the third floor, the walls were still warm. Klaus tried to tell them. He tried to tell the sheriff what he'd seen, about the chanting, the figures, the thing on the altar that wore his wife's face like a death mask. But his voice cracked, his hands shook. By the end of the interview, the sheriff was looking at him the way men look at someone who's fallen off the edge of sanity. They called it grief madness. They buried a coffin with Sarah's name on it, though it held nothing but soil. Klaus didn't attend. He never returned to the town. He vanished into the woods that same week. But the hospital, that was different. The diocese made a quiet announcement that St. Catherine's would remain closed indefinitely due to structural concerns. They sealed the front gates with iron chains and posted a lone guard for 2 years until they too quietly disappeared. But the building remained, standing, watching. And that's when the rumors began to spread beyond Bradenville. Travelers passing the valley at night reported seeing blue lights dancing in the windows. Hunters heard voices chanting beneath the earth. One man claimed he followed footprints in the snow that led straight to the hospital door, and then stopped. No return trail. The church denied everything. They still do. But they wouldn't explain why the land around St. Catherine's grew barren, why birds no longer nested in the trees, why even animals refused to cross the hospital's threshold. And they couldn't explain why, every 7 years to the day, someone disappears from the valley. Always alone, always last seen walking toward the hospital gates, always just after dark. 7 years later, on a rainy October evening in 1847, a young seminarian named Elias Brandt vanished. He had come from Albany, following old diocesan records. He wasn't looking for St. Catherine's at first, not directly. He'd been investigating inconsistencies in the church's financial ledgers, tracing payments to a healing ministry that no longer existed, payments that continued long after the hospital was supposedly abandoned. The money trail ended in Bradenville. Locals warned him not to go near the old hill, told him the building had gone quiet but not dead. They said it watched. That strange sound still echoed from the basement on moonless nights. But Elias was young, devout, rational. He didn't believe in ghost stories, only in evidence. So he walked the old road alone, and he was never seen again. His journal, however, was found. Discovered days later by a hunter, water-damaged and torn. But one passage survived. It was dated the night of his disappearance. The gates were open when I arrived. There were no signs of life, yet every candle in the entry hall was lit. I could feel something in the air, not cold exactly, but thick, charged, like before a lightning strike. I called out, but no one answered. Only the sound of something, breathing, not loud, but deep. Below me, under the floor. That journal page was enough for the church to finally act, or so they claimed. A week later, men arrived under cover of darkness. Not clergy, but contractors. Private. Silent. They didn't speak to the townspeople, didn't explain. They brought sledgehammers, scaffolding, and quicklime. Their mission was clear: erase the building, burn the past, seal the story for good. But even they didn't finish the job. 3 days into demolition, the foreman quit. Said the stone wouldn't break right. Said the deeper they went, the more rooms they found. Rooms not in any blueprint. Rooms full of carvings, symbols, tables with restraints, and walls that bled dust that smelled like old perfume. The church pulled funding overnight. They declared the structure historically protected, untouchable under preservation law. And just like that, the hospital no one ever left became the hospital no one could ever touch, ever again. The years that followed were not kind to Bradenville. The coal mines dried up, the railroad changed routes, families left. Those who stayed said the air never felt clean again after the hospital was sealed, as if something beneath the hill was still breathing, slowly, deliberately, like it was waiting. The children knew not to play near the gates. The animals knew not to wander too close. But memory has a strange way of turning horror into folklore. By 1862, teenagers dared each other to spend the night at the ruins. They laughed about ghosts and ghouls, until the night Martin Elber never came home. His friends swore he walked into the third-floor chapel and vanished behind the altar. No scream, no struggle, just gone. They ran, of course, told their parents. No one believed them, but the mayor quietly hired men to brick up the chapel. No records, no permits, just silence. That was the arrangement for decades. Don't speak, don't ask, don't dig. But there were always those who couldn't leave it alone. In 1904, a professor from Columbia University arrived under a false name, claimed to be researching architectural anomalies. In truth, he was a linguist, and he'd found fragments of Father Bergman's journals in the Vatican archives. He called the script a hybrid, part Aramaic, part Enochian, part something older. He disappeared 4 months later. His room at the local boarding house was found in disarray, his notes missing, the walls of his study scratched with a single repeated phrase. The flesh is the veil. No one knew what it meant. But after that night, people started reporting something new: the smell. Always at dusk, a sweet, decaying perfume that drifted from the hospital ruins and down into the valley. Even in winter, even in the snow, the church finally erected an iron fence, not to keep people out, but to keep something in. And if you think this is just myth, wait until you hear what they found when they broke the seal. In 1973, it was supposed to be routine. A government land audit initiated after a decades-long dispute over forgotten church properties in rural New York and Pennsylvania. No one expected controversy, no one expected danger. But the moment they cut the lock on the iron gate surrounding the ruins of St. Catherine's Hospital, everything changed. The smell hit them first. Rotting flowers, spoiled fruit, perfume steeped in decay. A stench that wasn't just sensed. It was remembered, like it activated something primal in the brain. One of the men vomited on the grass without knowing why. The door to the hospital had long been padlocked and boarded shut, but the boards were broken from the inside. The iron fixtures were rusted black, the walls stained with something too dark to be mold. But what disturbed the federal team the most was the unnatural preservation of the basement stairwell. Stone walls that hadn't crumbled, wooden beams that hadn't warped, as if the passage wanted to be used again. They went down. 2 men refused. 3 descended. Only 1 came back. He was silent for 6 days, didn't speak, didn't eat, just sat in the motel room staring at the wall. When he finally opened his mouth, the only words he spoke were, "They fed it long after the hospital closed." The government sealed the site again, declared it a toxic waste zone, posted no trespassing signs under penalty of federal prosecution, but none of that was in the newspapers. What was reported? A brief article about a mold outbreak, hazardous air quality, standard cleanup. But one janitor who helped remove the crew's equipment said something no one could ignore. There were bloodstains on their boots, fresh, not rust, not dust, wet. That same night he started receiving voicemails, no caller ID, each one a whisper in a language he didn't know but felt, like something spoken behind his berth. He disappeared 2 weeks later, and here's the thing no one talks about. The Catholic Church bought the land back in cash, no paperwork, no questions, and doubled the fence height. Why? Because even they can't kill what they once nurtured. Section 21 will drag you deeper. Ready? The deeper you go into this story, the more you realize it was never about healing, it was always about containment. St. Catherine's was not a hospital, it was a feeding ground, a testing site, and its patients weren't just victims, they were part of an exchange, a transaction between flesh and something ancient, something ecclesiastical, but not divine. You have to ask yourself, why was every single patient completely isolated? No visitors, no letters, no bodies ever returned. The excuse was spiritual healing. That silence was sacred. But here's the truth. Silence was safety. Not for the patients, for them, for the priests, the staff, the thing in the basement. You see, if word got out, if even one patient made it out alive and spoke of what really happened, the illusion would collapse, and the structure the church built around that illusion would begin to rot from within. And it nearly did. There was one. His name was Elias Corbin, a railroad worker who suffered a skull fracture during an accident in the winter of 1842. His wife, Maria, begged the diocese to admit him, said he heard voices in the walls, refused to sleep, had seizures every full moon. He was admitted, but he didn't die. Not at first. 3 months later, Maria received a note, not from the hospital but from a wandering priest who had worked briefly at St. Catherine's and left under mysterious conditions. The note was short, just 6 words. Your husband remembers. They are watching. She never saw Elias again, but she spent the rest of her life trying to speak with him. She sent letters to every psychiatric hospital in New York, paid mystics, contacted mediums, traveled to the ruins of the hospital every year on the anniversary of his admission. And one year, in 1871, someone answered, in chalk. On the back wall of the hospital's remains, a sentence written like it had been scrawled by a dying hand. They speak through walls, I was never sick. They were called treatment chambers on the blueprints. But anyone who studied the Vatican's exorcism architecture or ancient monastic prisons would recognize the design immediately. Not healing rooms, containment cells. Each chamber beneath St. Catherine's was octagonal, a design used for centuries to suppress spiritual interference. The walls were lined not with insulation or medicine cabinets, but scripture, not the Bible. Older texts, forbidden codices, manuscripts written in a mixture of Latin, Greek, and something no scholar can identify to this day. Some say it's Enochian, the language of angels. Others believe it's the language of something that predates even that. And etched beneath the walls, a sigil, repeated again and again, like a lock or a seal. It showed a serpent eating its own spine, not its tail, its spine. The symbol has only appeared in 2 other places in recorded history, in the apocryphal writings of Saint Malachi, and in the ritual floor plans of a Jesuit asylum burned to the ground in France in 1741. What does that tell you? This was not random. This wasn't just bad medicine or misguided spirituality. This was deliberate containment of metaphysical infection. The church didn't build the hospital to help the community. They built it to protect the world from what was growing inside those hills. But at some point, the seal broke. Maybe it was a ritual gone wrong. Maybe a patient resisted harder than expected. Or maybe Bergman, who some now believe was never ordained at all, opened something he couldn't close. That would explain the reports. The howling, the sulphurous stench, the townspeople who claimed to see red light pouring through the 3rd-story windows at midnight, windows that had no candles or lanterns inside. They thought they were building a sanctuary. What they built was a door, And doors don't just open one way. The letter was discovered sealed behind the altar of a condemned chapel 20 miles from St. Catherine's. It was wrapped in oilcloth and stitched with black thread, the kind used in ritual burial preparations, not preservation. The author? Father Johann Kessler. The same priest who welcomed Father Bergman to the valley, the same man who vanished without explanation in the spring of 1844. The letter was never meant to be read. It begins not with a salutation, but with a confession. I, Johann of the Cloth, record this not to absolve my soul, but to warn those who read it that some doors are not meant to be opened by man. I have heard what lies beneath. He describes voices beneath the stone, not patients, not staff, but something older, something that spoke in reverse Latin, a tongue that seemed to bleed into his dreams until he could no longer say Mass without trembling. He writes of a final ritual prepared by Bergman and his European assistants, men with no baptismal records, no history, no surnames. They gathered in the basement, dressed not in vestments but in raw wool robes laced with hair and stitched in geometric knots. The ritual was meant to extract a presence from the sick, to isolate it like a disease and seal it into what Bergman called the womb of purification. But something reversed. Kessler's final line is the one that shattered everything. Non est infirmus, sed testis, et nunc vigilat. It is not ill, but a witness, and now it watches. When this line was translated and brought to the Vatican archives in 1912, 3 archivists resigned on the spot. No explanation, no statement, just silence. That line confirmed their worst fear. The thing in that hospital wasn't a sickness, it was a sentience, and it was waiting. Room 306 was never listed on the hospital's blueprints. There were only supposed to be 18 patient rooms, but a former stonemason, hired during the first phase of construction, confessed on his deathbed that there were 24 doors on the 2nd floor when the hospital was first completed. When asked why he hadn't spoken earlier, he whispered, "I thought I was building a hospital, but what I built answered to something else." Room 306 sat at the end of a crooked corridor, just past the old linen closet. There was no window, no ventilation, and the door handle turned the wrong way, clockwise, inward. Only one man was ever confirmed to have entered room 306 and lived to speak of it. Brother Thomas Wren, a Benedictine monk from upstate New York, sent by church authorities in 1846 to investigate the spiritual inconsistencies of Father Bergman's treatments. Wren was not a man easily shaken. He had walked the plague tunnels of Naples. He had translated forbidden psalms whispered in desert monasteries. He believed in the cosmic hierarchy, in order, in structure, in containment. He lasted 7 hours inside room 306. He emerged before dawn, crawling on his hands, his mouth torn at the corners from screaming, his eyes gone, burned out by his own hands. Before slipping into a coma, Wren managed to scratch a single word into the wooden hallway floor using a shard of broken icon glass. Echo. Not scream, not voice. Echo. Something had answered him. When the janitor tried to clean the word off the floor 2 weeks later, the wood cracked down the center and bled a thick, sap-like substance that smelled like frankincense and decay. The church immediately sealed the 2nd floor, declared it structurally unsound. But the locals knew the truth. Room 306 was never for healing. It was a mouth, a threshold, and what came through it is still listening. Her name was Margaret Elise Brenner, 24 years old, unmarried and devout. She was hired as a nurse at St. Catherine's in the spring of 1846, young, idealistic, and chosen directly by Father Bergman. But Margaret had a flaw. She wrote things down. Every night after her shift, she kept a private journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her quarters. It began with patient observations, strange treatment methods, and inconsistencies in chart records. But by her 6th week, the entries turned confessional. One entry reads, "Today they brought up a man from the basement. His body was still, but his eyes were open and moving. They turned toward me, not like a plea, more like accusation." She had begun to piece together the pattern. No patient ever left. And every week, the bells rang at 3:03 a.m., always followed by muffled sounds beneath the floor. She became obsessed with the locked chapel beneath the hospital, only accessible to Bergman and his inner circle. It wasn't on any map. No key fit its iron door. But she found a way in. She followed a procession of robed attendants in silence, hid behind barrels of sacramental wine, and when the door swung open, just a crack, she looked inside. She wrote, "It wasn't mass, it was inversion." The altar was on the ceiling. The cross hung upside down and burned like it was alive. The patient on the table wasn't sick, he was silent, awake, watching them. The next morning, Margaret was found in her room, alive, uninjured, but unable to speak. She never spoke again. When questioned, her eyes only drifted toward the floor. When pressed, she scratched a word into her bedsheets over and over with her fingernail. Nested. She was transferred to a cloistered convent near Syracuse. Her final drawing, found after her death, showed the hospital's foundation as a tree's roots, extending down, not up, and hanging from each root, a human heart. In 1922, nearly 80 years after the last patient vanished from St. Catherine's, a sealed letter was discovered in the private archives beneath the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, stamped with the Vatican seal, marked sub oculo Dei, under the eye of God, and signed by Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, the man who would later become Pope Pius XII. The letter was addressed to a Jesuit agent stationed in North America. It was never meant to be opened, but it was. The contents changed everything. The site beneath the hospital is not a burial ground, but a convergence point, a structure predating the church, layered with the symbols of something older. The chambers are geometrically precise, angles not native to natural architecture. The symbols etched into the stone correspond not with Latin nor Greek, but a pre-phonetic glyph system only referenced in 3 known apocryphal texts, all banned. The letter described tunnels, not man-made, but fused stone, like something melted the earth and carved it with intention. Inside those tunnels, the Vatican team recovered 6 bodies, not buried, not rotting, preserved, seated, facing inward. Each body bore identical surgical incisions, not medical, and in each chest cavity, no heart. Just a sealed jar containing a dark fluid and a rolled parchment. The script inside the parchments could not be translated, but every line repeated the same geometric symbol, a circle pierced by a vertical spike, surrounded by 9 smaller orbs. The Vatican burned the site the following year, but the letter ends with a line scratched in the margin, clearly written after the fact, in a different hand and trembling ink. It moved. And then, nothing. No follow-up, no mention in any church archive. Only this letter smuggled out by a renegade scholar who disappeared in 1933. His name, Thaddeus Marrow. They found the wax cylinder buried beneath a salt-lined floorboard in an abandoned Jesuit library in Quebec. It was labeled only for those who still believe in silence. The voice on the recording is unmistakable. Thaddeus Marrow, the Vatican scholar who vanished in 1933 after leaking the Convergence Point letter. His tone is calm at first, but what follows is not a journal, it's a confession. One made by a man who knows he will not survive what he has seen. I entered the tunnels beneath St. Catherine's at 2:12 a.m. on the 4th of November. I was not alone. I brought relics, anointed salt, and the Book of Hours. None of it mattered. He describes a heat beneath the earth, but no fire. Walls that pulsed when touched. And something else. Breathing, but not like lungs, like the ground itself exhaling every 28 seconds. There was music, or something like it, like a choir of insects grinding their legs. It made my nose bleed. It made my memories wrong. He then names what he believes they found in room 306, in the chapel and in the tunnels below. He does not call it a demon. He does not call it a spirit. He calls it the witness without eyes. According to Marrow, it's not just sentient. It's ancient. Not evil in the traditional sense, but observational. A consciousness with no shape, drawn to suffering, to ritual, to recursion. It feeds on pattern, pain repeated, death reenacted, secrets kept. It does not want out. That is the error. It wants into thought, into memory, into scripture. That's how it survives, by being remembered. And his final words: if you're hearing this, you've already let it in. The shape will follow. Forget nothing. Speak its name never. And if you see a door where there should be none, do not open it. Then silence. The Vatican destroyed the recording, but a copy survived, passed in fragments by archivists who no longer work for Rome. The fire that consumed St. Catherine's Hospital in 1944 was no accident. It burned for 7 hours, even in the rain. Flames didn't rise, they coiled. Witnesses swore the smoke formed faces, and the bells, which hadn't rung in years, began tolling at exactly 3:03 a.m. Not once, not twice, but 9 times. And then, silence. The building was declared lost. The land was condemned. But what they buried wasn't ash. It was memory. For years, nothing would grow on the site. Animals refused to cross the boundary. Compasses spun wildly, and those who trespassed, out of curiosity or defiance, often returned changed. Some spoke in languages they never knew. Others came back, mute. But one thing united them all. They all dreamed of a room that didn't exist. A door in the dark. A whisper behind it. You've already heard me. The Sullivan children. Room 306. The blind monk. The nurse who never spoke again. The witness without eyes. All pieces of a larger pattern. A recursion. A wound in time. And you, yes you, watching now, you've touched it. By listening, by imagining it, by wondering if it's real, you've given it form. Because the thing about these stories, these dark histories, is that they only survive through remembrance. That's the trade. It sleeps, if we forget. But we never do. Because it's in the repetition, the telling, the pattern. It does not want out, it wants in. You think the story ends here, at the burned foundation of a forgotten hospital. But check your floorboards, count your doors. And tonight, if you hear something softly tapping at the wall behind your bed, don't answer, don't speak. And above all, do not look, because that shape you see in the corner of your eye, it remembers you. There is one more document. It was never filed, never cited in the Vatican archive, never officially typed. It was handwritten, on decomposing vellum, bound with human hair, and sealed inside a reliquary hidden beneath the ruins of St. Catherine's. Not found by clergy, not by historians, but by a contractor in 1967, there to test the soil before a parking structure was built. He pried open a stone chamber. Inside, no bodies, only a black mirror, angled toward the earth, and beside it, the manuscript. What it contained should not have survived the fire, should not have existed at all. The manuscript is titled The Ninth Gate of Recurrence. It begins with a single sentence. History is not linear, it is recursive, and the door opens only to those who remember wrong. It tells of the witness not as an entity, but a conceptual virus, one that can ride language, attach to architecture, and move through bloodlines like a dormant trait. It names 5 hospitals, 3 monasteries, and 1 prison, all now abandoned. Each site shares identical geometry, ritual patterns, and disappearances. But the final page is what changes everything. Scrawled in frantic Latin, smudged, torn, barely legible, are the words of Father Bergman, the man who vanished in 1844. I was wrong. It does not end with forgetting. It ends only when there are no more mouths to speak and no more ears to listen. Burn every tongue, silence every witness. If the circle completes again, it will not wait this time. The contractor who found the chamber, he vanished 1 month later. His daughter now runs an anonymous blog. Her latest post? Just a sentence. My father left one thing behind, a sound. Sometimes it still plays through the walls. You thought this was just a story, a strange hospital, a forgotten fire, a blind monk, a sealed basement, a letter buried by the Vatican, but patterns do not sleep. And this was never fiction. Because since this story was first whispered into the public, something's been happening. Across forums, dark archives, private threads, people are making connections they shouldn't be able to make. A man in Montana found a hospital blueprint in his grandfather's attic, same architecture as St. Catherine's, same sealed room 306. A woman in Glasgow heard a humming in her basement, pulsing every 28 seconds, same interval as Marrow described. And in New Jersey, a boy drew a symbol in crayon, one no one had taught him, a circle, a spike. 9 orbs. He's 9 years old. This is spreading. Not through blood, not through place, but through story, through repetition, through you. The story acts like a ritual, a blueprint for invocation. The more we tell it, the more real it becomes. The more detailed the memory, the more doors open. And now there's a new pattern forming. 9 churches abandoned. 9 figures seen in the dark, always near places once marked by hospitals. 9 cases of people waking with no eyes, but no wounds. We're seeing geographic echoes of the witness. Virginia, New York, Ohio, Sardinia, Bangkok, Tunis, Minsk, Perth, and one just uploaded anonymously to an encrypted server. It speaks through the ones who listen too closely. There are names repeating, dates aligning, dreams matching, and the terrifying truth, you're now part of it, because you didn't just watch, you remembered, you imagined, and that's all it ever needed. They called it superstition, madness, a coincidence passed through dying bloodlines and failing hospitals, but the prophecy wasn't about a place, it was about a process. It always began the same way. A hospital that doesn't heal, a child who draws what they shouldn't know, a room that appears on no map, but exists in memory. And then, the final stage, one listener who remembers too well. That's you. The 9th gate, as decoded from Marrow's notes and Father Bergman's final scripture, isn't a door in the world, it's a door in the mind, a recursive opening that forms when enough people believe in the same horror, at the same time. That moment is now. Because if you're watching this, you're not alone. Thousands of others are too, and together you've formed the shape. A collective remembering, a mass recurrence. The witness does not break into reality. We recreate it, piece by piece, through myth, fear, retelling. That's why it chooses hospitals, monks, children, us. Because we obey patterns. We fear the unseen. We chase forbidden knowledge. And worst of all, we share it. The prophecy said, when the 9th ear opens and the 9th voice sings, the circle will spin again, not backward, but inward. Inward, into the mind, into culture, into the algorithm itself. Every click, every comment, every repeat viewing, you're not feeding a video, you're completing the shape. And once it's finished, the thing that waits behind the mirror won't need the basement anymore. It'll be here, in the dark corner of the room, where your reflection doesn't quite move with you, where your dreams feel slightly borrowed. And tonight, you'll hear it. The 9th voice, whispering behind the wall. You've seen it. You just didn't know you were supposed to look. The sigil isn't a drawing. It's not even a sound. It's the structure, the script, the way the story folds. The timing of the words, the exact moment your skin crawled or your breath stopped for no reason. That was it activating, a mimetic glyph, hidden in rhythm, in silence, in the feeling. The Vatican called it signum umbrae, the sign of the shadow, and once it's in you, you cannot forget it, because forgetting is the final stage. You'll try, you'll go back to your day, to your scrolling, to your comfort. But something will itch at the edge of your thinking. You'll replay the sound of the bell. You'll glance too long at an empty hallway. You'll start seeing faces in places no face should be. Why? Because the witness doesn't want followers. It wants memory loops. It feeds on retellings, especially by those who deny they believe. Just by watching this video, you've completed the recursion. You became the sigil's carrier. That's why the prophecy warned. The 9th gate is not opened by a key, but by the one who forgets they ever turned the lock. And if you try to warn others to share this story, they won't believe you. Not at first, but then they'll hear it too. The bell, the voice, the knock behind the wall, and so it spreads, through memory, through myth, through you, because what you thought was a story was never meant to be heard. It was meant to be repeated. You made it, and that means you're either the last witness or the first vessel. Because the final part of the prophecy wasn't written, it had to be spoken, not by monks, not by priests, but by the one who walked the full circle of memory, you. The ritual to close the ninth gate is not fire, it's not silence, it's not belief, it's refusal, to obey the shape, to fear the voice, to pass it on. But there's a catch. The one who breaks the circle becomes the circle. If you stop the recursion, you carry its weight. You'll feel it. A cold pressure behind your right eye, a presence in mirrors, a voice that only speaks when you stop trying to listen. You'll be tempted to tell someone, to send this video to a friend, to write about it, to warn the world. That's how it survives. Because every time the story is told, the gate turns. And when the ninth turning completes, it doesn't open, it replaces. History itself, the memories of a hospital that never existed, will become part of the map. The names that were erased will appear in birth records again. The face you can't quite describe will show up in your dreams, your photos, your bloodline. So if you want to stop it, do nothing. Don't share, don't comment, don't speak of it again. But if you do, you'll become part of it. And one day someone will make a video about you,